Hi, Susie Homesteader of the Rockies, and welcome to the Susie Homesteader channel. And today we're going to do a 5-part series on using a wood stove. And we're going to start with the first video, which is going to be on types of wood stoves, and then in the second one after that on how to actually start a fire in your wood stove, which, believe it or not, a lot of people don't actually know how to do. So look for some of my other videos where we're going to actually start talking about the kinds of wood that are the most efficient for your wood stove, where to get that wood, how to store that wood, some of the tools you'll need to purchase to actually do it yourself, and all kinds of other fun subjects and interviews that we'll do where we'll talk about just the wood itself that you're going to use for your wood stove. And then we'll also talk a little bit about cleaning your wood stove and cleaning your chimney, which maybe one of the later videos, because we're not going to do that one till the spring, because it's about 20 below here right now in this part of the Rockies. So we're going to stay indoors, and when we get done with a couple more of these, we'll do another one on how to cook on a wood stove, which will be another fun one. So let's start by talking about different types of wood stoves. There's a couple different ways you can go. The first one would be a pellet stove, which does require electricity to run it, and it also does require actually buying pellets, manufactured pellets to put in that stove. They are super clean, super efficient, but are not going to help you out too much in the case of a power outage. The second kind of stove, which is what we're going to show you right here, is a good old-fashioned steel or cast iron or soapstone stoves. Of course, there's also a wood cooktop stove, which also allows you to cook on top of your wood stove with different little burners, and sometimes that cooktop can actually be removable or it's permanent. And then of course there's the antique style version of those, which are absolutely beautiful, and everybody would love to have one, but are not the most efficient. And then there's also, of course, a gas propane stove insert, which does require that you have a propane tank hooked up outside somewhere to actually run that heat. And then last but not least, there's also just a good old-fashioned fireplace with a mantle that is usually built into your home with a brick chimney, which unfortunately are not the most efficient way to burn heat. You'll only get about 20 to 30% of the actual heat draw from a built-in fireplace, as opposed to a wood stove where you're going to get about 60 to 70% of the heat that will radiate from the wood that you burn in a metal box like this. So all different kinds of options on different kinds of wood stoves that you can choose, but a lot of your decisions are going to be based mainly on the space that you have available in your home to place that wood stove. Now, there are a lot of codes and clearances that you want to take into consideration when you're putting in a wood stove, so that you don't have any safety issues. You may also want to check with your homeowner's insurance first to see how they feel about you having a wood stove. Sometimes it'll cost you less if you have a second source of heat as a backup on your insurance, and sometimes it will cost you more because they're not always that comfortable with wood stoves. Another thing to consider is just the space that you have around the area that you're going to put your wood stove in, and the size of your house and the size of the room that it's going into. So lots of things to think about when you're picking out your wood stove. If you are going to a wood stove store, they're going to help you make all those decisions. And then, of course, the second choice you have for getting a wood stove is buying a used wood stove, which I've done on several different projects. But you do kind of want to stay in the range of 1990 or later on your wood stoves. Anything prior to 1990 is probably not going to be as efficient of an actual appliance for you, because the EPA standards changed after that year. And so if you do wind up buying a used one or picking one up at a pawn shop or wherever you get it from, try and stick with that year or later. So lots of things to think about when you are picking out your stove. And then of course price is always a big factor. And then you're also going to take into consideration whether this is going to be your main source of heat or a second source of heat in your home. Now in my case, this house I had already had a furnace, a forced air heat furnace built in, but the electric bill I had when I ran that all winter long in this part of the Rockies was sky high. So my option was to install a wood stove, and that saved me almost $200 to $250 a month on my electric bill. I haven't used my furnace in probably 10-15 years because I just don't need it, because this wood stove that I have, which is sort of a medium size stove, does heat a 1,200 square foot area on a top floor and does the job fine. So, you know, if you're buying one at an actual store, buying a new one, you know, they'll talk to you about whether you have a 1-story home, a 2-story home, the size of the room, how many doors are taken into consideration, how big of a room in general, how much, you know, open area you have in that room to heat. So that'll also determine whether you need a small, medium, or large stove as well. So the one I have here, this Country stove, they've been making those forever. That's kind of a medium price range for stoves. It is steel as opposed to a cast iron, which does not hold the heat as well as a cast iron stove. But I've had this stove in here for 20 years. It's great. I love it. It's kind of taken a beating. There's maybe only a few things that I've ever had to replace on this stove. And what that turns out to be is just the bricks that line the inside of your stove. Sometimes if you run your stove too hot, those bricks will crack. Or if you have somebody just shoving in some wood in there super hard, that will also crack your bricks, especially if they're that hot. So I have had to replace a few bricks on the inside of my stove. I have had to replace this rope, this kind of a gasket style rope that's on that inside of your door, and that's super important to have a real tight fit on that, because if you don't have this rope in there nice and tight, it may create too much of a draft and your fires will burn faster. So you want that rope, which is real easy to replace, super tight and well in place on your door. Now, I do know a few people who have actually cracked the glass on their doors as well, and that's generally because somebody's just trying to shove some wood in there and close it with the glass door, and the wood at some point just breaks the glass altogether. So it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and I have seen people do it. And then in that case, you just have to take the door off and go get a new piece of glass put in. So there really isn't that much maintenance on your wood stove or things that you'd ever have to replace if you're taking good care of it. So again, I love this stove. It does the job. I'll have a list for you of some tools that you might want to kind of have sitting around after you get your wood stove installed. And some of them I have and some of them I don't, but I'll have a list for you of some good tools to go with your fireplace. But the other thing you really want to start talking about is how you're going to have your wood stove installed. I did have this one professionally put in. My homeowner's insurance did require that I had that professionally done, but if you're doing it yourself, which I have done on, as I said, a couple other projects, just make sure you know what the codes are for your state and the clearance levels for around your wood stove, just so you don't burn your house down. And most of that has to do with your non-combustible materials that you're going to have behind your stove. So there's two kinds of materials. There's combustible and there's non-combustible. This particular hearth I put in, which I have to say I will never do again, because that was one of the hardest projects I ever did. But it's a non-combustible material. So in this state, the clearance for that is really just like 12 inches away from any corner of the stove to that non-combustible wall. If you have a combustible wall, like drywall or some of the other building materials that are already there, then you need about a 3-foot clearance. But check with your state and check with the codes. And there's some other things you may have to do with venting and creating drafts and vacuums for your stove that get into a lot of detail. So it may be worth your while to have somebody professional install it for you just for safety reasons. Besides the stove that you're going to buy itself, you're also going to buy some stove pipe. That stove pipe usually comes in a 6 or an 8-inch diameter. The straighter you have that run on your pipe, the better. The more elbows and the more angles you have on that pipe, the harder it is to get a nice straight draw or a vacuum of air through that, that part that's going to be vented. So the straighter the better. But besides this straight pipe, the single wall straight pipe that you're going to need on your stove, as you can see up at the very top there, it turns into a double wall or even possibly a triple wall pipe that's actually going to go through your roof. So depending on what your roof consists of as well, you'll need a different kind of an insulated pipe that's actually going to touch the materials in your ceiling and your roof that are also non-combustible and non-flammable. So lots of little goodies that go with your wood stove. It isn't obviously as expensive to buy the rest of these materials as the stove itself, but by the time you get outside the roof and you get all the way up to that roof cap or that the vent up at the top there, you know, it gets a little costly, a little more costly than you think. And then of course going back to just needing little odds and end tools that really make it a lot easier. So as you can see, I have a non-combustible background, and then I also have a non-combustible hearth, you know, a rock hearth on the bottom that was not built in, but I just bought separately and threw it down on the floor. So there's lots of ways to, lots of things to set your stove on as well. You can, you know, this part you can do by yourself. It's pretty easy if you buy these kind of pre-made, these little slabs, or you can, you know, construct your own, which I've also done. But these are super easy. You just buy them in one piece, lay it down, and get your stove on there. Another part of a wood stove that they're always going to have, but they're always different, is going to be your damper. Now, some dampers will actually be up in the stove pipe itself, which I have on some other stoves, and some will be somewhere else. Every stove is designed very, very different. But this is your damper, and this is what's going to regulate your flow of air or your oxygen. So obviously the challenge with a wood stove is that you're not outside where you have all kinds of oxygen and air to fuel that fire. You're essentially building a fire in a metal box with very little oxygen and very little ventilation. So some people, if they have a real problem with that draw, they can also install vents down in the bottom that can go directly into a duct system under the floor and outside to create more of a draw. So lots of different types of stoves. Like I said, some are easier to work with than others. This one, I only have the damper here, but if I had a problem with the draw of oxygen, I could have put a second one up in the pipe, but I really didn't need it. So, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I have a straight pipe, and that helps quite a bit. So that's about the basics on a wood stove that you're going to wind up purchasing at some point. Lots of fun little doodads, like, you know, having a kettle is nice just to create some more humidity, and having a trivet to put on top of that. Any materials that you store near your stove, this is really as close as you want to get. You know, I mean, it is kind of nice to have your wood somewhat close, especially if some of that gets wet or has snow on it from the outside. It's kind of nice to have it close enough that it will dry out. But things like newspapers and more flammable materials, you want as far away from your stove as possible. So the more flammable, the farther away you want it. Again, you know, this is getting really close, but we've never had a problem with it. So there's a kindling bucket, which is kind of key. And then of course I also have a metal wood bucket. So you do not want to put wood style buckets or wood in wood style buckets. You want to stick to metal, so that way if something did catch on fire, it would stay contained in the metal. So all kind of common sense stuff. You know, and this is just a metal bucket that you're going to want to put your ashes in when you start cleaning it out, and we'll talk about that later. It's nicer if these have a lid. That's because those ashes, even when you're taking them out in the charcoal, when you're taking them out of the wood stove, they do fly into the air. So if you just have to cover that with a newspaper or you can get one that has a lid on it. It's even nicer. But you absolutely need a metal ash bucket, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this video, because I can't tell you how many house fires I've heard of, not because the chimney wasn't cleaned properly, but because they took an ash bucket like this, or maybe didn't even use a metal bucket, and set that hot bucket even on just a wood porch or a floor inside the home next to some draperies or curtains. But I have heard of more houses catching on fire because of this ash bucket. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but when you have this ash bucket with the ashes in it, it has to go directly outside into the cold, not touching any wood, and either in a designated ash pile, which I have back by my compost bin, or in another metal container away from any outbuildings. And there's some stories about that too, where people have dumped their ashes outside near an outbuilding, and the ashes found some way to continue burning, and their outbuilding burned down. So many horror stories I can tell you about ashes in a bucket, and it's just got to be disposed of properly. So, you know, again, I'll have another video for you on how to clean your chimney, and how the statistics on how many chimney fires there are as well. But this is the second statistic that you just can't believe people can be that stupid about. Okay, so this is something else you have to have, and again, I would prefer to have one with a lid, which they do make. And this gets super hot at the bottom, so that wouldn't even be technically sitting on carpeting or even a laminate floor. That should be sitting up on the rocks or the hearth while you're actually filling that up. I've seen them catch on fire in the house. I've seen them catch on fire in the bucket. So I can't stress to you enough how dangerous that gets with these ash buckets. And on that note, something else you want to do before you start cleaning out your wood stove is going to be shutting off a ceiling fan. That ceiling fan is on reverse, so what that's doing is the heat from the stove, which is fairly close by, as you can see, is obviously rising because heat rises, and then that ceiling fan is pushing that heat back down and helping circulate it through the house a little bit better. So all that heat isn't just trapped up at the top of the ceiling. So that's another way to help use your heat a little bit more efficiently, is to have a ceiling fan somewhat close by. And another thing that a lot of stoves come with, some of them will have a built-in blower, which will also blow out some of the heat from the stove itself. For some reason, I don't really seem to need that, and maybe it's because I do have the fan to go with it. And then if it doesn't come with a blower and you don't have a place to install a ceiling fan close by, you can also do a little stovetop fan. And some of them have a thermostat kind of built into it, so it will just turn on and off by itself based on the amount of heat that comes off the top of the stove. Some people think those are completely worthless, so don't purchase a really expensive one, because I'm not really sure how efficient those are. But don't ever try and put like a plastic fan or some floor model or something close by to your fireplace, because it will melt. So, you know, some kind of ventilation and circulation of the heat is important. So again, you may just wind up with some kind of a little stovetop metal fan that will help circulate that too. And then sometimes they're called heat registers, or they're still called blowers, but they can be installed in the pipe itself, which I have on another wood stove. And that is plugged into some electrical outlet somewhere, kind of away from the heat. But that heat register, and some of them have thermostats built in as well, other than the actual electrical part of it. But that heat register that will be set inside the pipe, kind of towards the lower end of the pipe there somewhere, will also blow out the heat that comes out of the pipe, as opposed to the stove, and then circulate the warm air through that heat register. So lots of ways to kind of get that heat flowing through your house as well. It does help sometimes to have a little cracked window open for ventilation and circulation, and sometimes if you have too much ventilation, that will mess up the draw that you're going to get from your stove. So some of that we'll talk about a little bit more when we do the video on how to start a fire in your wood stove, because you do need some of that oxygen that you don't get from the outside inside. somehow. So sometimes that requires just leaving the door open a crack when you're starting that fire, but that's a large part of the formula on using your wood stove. So many types of wood stoves to choose from. I cannot tell you how many different variations there are. Some have glass doors, some do not. The older models didn't really have the glass. They had just the usually the cast iron door, and sometimes it's a single door, sometimes it's a double door. Some of them have glass or a solid front door, but you can load the wood from the side or either side. So there are just so many different versions of your stove that you can choose from, and a lot of that again is just going to kind of be based on the location that it's going, which is how you choose most of your appliances. But this, like I said, this wood stove is the most important appliance I have out here in the Rockies, and of course that's just because it gets really cold here. So I thought this was a good time to talk to you guys about wood stoves because it's 20 below here right now in the Rockies in January. So good luck finding your wood stove, and look for some more of my videos where we'll talk about all kinds of aspects that are going to go along with the giant investment you're going to make in a wood stove. So if you have any questions, come see me on my website, Susie Homesteader of the Rockies, and I'll have supply lists and shopping links available for you. So we'll see you there. Bye-bye. Let's get started. Subscribe to the Susie Homesteader channel, and we'll see you there. Bye-bye.